Welcome to Roanoke Remembered. Your host, John Garland, chats today about the importance of local history with his guest, Dr. Johnny Moore, a retired professor emeritus of history from Radford University. So sit back and enjoy episode 1 of Roanoke Remembered.
Welcome to episode 1 of Roanoke Remembered, where yesterday meets tomorrow. I'm going to explain a little bit about what that means, and I need to introduce myself since this is episode 1. And I also need to introduce my guest, my lifelong friend, John Boy number 2, and I'll explain that here in a minute. So I'm a lifelong Roanoker, having been born in Roanoke off of Williamson Road, born at Jefferson Hospital, which is historical in itself because it no longer exists. Was on Franklin Road, even though it was named Jefferson Hospital. Went to Huff Lane Elementary School, Brackenridge Middle School, William Fleming High School, and then went off to Virginia Tech for 5 years. And graduated, got away from Roanoke just a little bit, came back, primarily because we started having kids and I need to be close to grandparents to help take care of grandkids. So we've been there ever since, only away for about 2 or 3 years. I've been an engineer, had an architecture engineering firm, do development now, historical preservation. We'll hopefully be able to talk about that in future episodes. So a little bit about me. Now, my guest, Johnny Moore, better known to me as John Boy. He calls me John Boy, I call him John Boy, since we're both named John. So you don't get confused. I'm John Boy number 1, he's John Boy number 2. Hope that doesn't upset you. John Boy number 2 is lifelong Roanoker as well. Grew up in Roanoke, was born at the Lewis Gale Hospital, which is still here, but it's not here where it was when he was born. Both those hospitals are in Old Southwest. Lots of hospitals to talk about in future episodes that were in Old Southwest. John Boy number 2 went to Tech 2, also went to Preston Park, which is actually closer to me than Huff Lane, but it was across Williamson Road, so we're both Williamson Road boys. Went to Breckenridge, went to William Fleming, went to Virginia Tech. So we got together principally in Virginia Tech as roommates, and we're roommates there, roommates after Tech while we were both single. So roommates about 5 years. He stayed at Tech, got his master's degree in history, then went to UVA, got his doctorate in history at UVA, and he is just retired, and he is professor emeritus from Radford University, having served Radford University for 37 years as a history professor, has written 3 books, untold numbers of publications, has spoken on those publications all over the United States. And I wanted him, I thought it'd be very appropriate to have him here because, which is what I want to do now, is talk a little bit now about why Roanoke remembered, why remember Roanoke. And I want remembering Roanoke to be more than just 2 old guys talking about nostalgic things about when they were kids, because one thing about nostalgia, you can remember things and they're always perceived better than maybe they actually were. You kind of build it up, and doesn't necessarily relate to today, but what I want to make sure is in Roanoke Remember, we talk about things in the past in Roanoke that have historical significance, things that we can take value in, things that moving forward that people can learn from what has happened in the past. And not just be two old men rambling towards each other. It may be a place, and we can talk about different places over the years that have been one thing and has become something else that have specific meaning relative to now. We can talk about events that have passed in the past. One event comes to mind is the Victory Stadium football game between VMI and VPI. We can talk about that and how that informs today. How it's perceived back in the day. We can talk about people, which is probably some of the more important things. Talk about our mentors. Talk about significant figures in the past that have had positive outcomes for Roanoke that have lived beyond them. It may be future mayors. It may be, former mayors. It may be former, race activists that have changed things in Roanoke. Lots and lots of opportunities there. Organizations that have existed in the past, some still exist, some don't. Organizations have a significant part in today, even though they may have just existed in the past. Government highlights. We can talk about, like I said, former mayors and former city managers, people that we've learned things from, people that have had a great effect for the valley. So what I want to do now, again, is to emphasize why I feel like history is important, but I can't talk about history as an expert because I'm not an expert in history, but I know enough about it to know that it's important. So I brought my own expert to talk about why history is important, and particularly how history is important in informing Roanoke today. So John Boyd, number 2, can you take it away and help inform us about that?
So you're ready to kick some past?
I am.
All right then, let's do it. So that's actually how I introduced usually the first day of classes that I taught. Let's kick some past. First I might want to say a word about the origin of the word nostalgia, which is quite interesting, I think. It comes from 2 Greek words, meaning from nostos, meaning return home, and algos, which means pain. And the first use of the term appears to have come in a medical treatise from the 18th century and was considered to be a disease that specifically referred to mercenaries who were far away from home and pining for home, thinking they were never going to return home. So it's kind of profound homesickness, thinking they would never return. So it's interesting, I think, that it's actually a medical term originally. Then it went through the German and then to the English nostalgia. Of course, history is important because we're all the products of our past, whether we want to be or not, both individually and collectively. When you go to the medical doctor, it's kind of annoying. I don't know if they use clipboards anymore that much, but first time you go to a medical doctor, they hand you a clipboard with a bunch of papers on it and what you're supposed to do before they will even talk to you at all. Put you in that little white thing with your rear end hanging out and make you wait. Take your medical history because you're connected to the people that sired you, whether you like it or not, whether it was a good experience or bad experience growing up. But obviously, if one of your parents was prone to different diseases, it enhances your chance of getting that. And so that's important. So it's important physiologically, it's important psychologically, it's important emotionally. And we are the growing edge of the past. I always think of it like a balloon, that we're on, if the balloon inside the air inside the balloon is the past, we're on the top of that balloon and is expanding into the future. And you're on that balloon. We're all on that same balloon. It happens to be called the Earth. And I think we get a real sense of that when we see the pictures of the Earth from the astronauts who were first orbiting the moon, were planning on going back, and you begin to realize that there are no boundaries in the ground. I remember as a kid when we would go to Myrtle Beach, and we would pass from Virginia to North Carolina and to South Carolina. I'd ask my dad, I thought the map, there's lines, where's that line? That there was actually a line, in the ground or something. Those lines are artificial. They change all the time geopolitically based on wars, religions, all kinds of things. But, we're all connected, whether we like it or not. And we all have to share this planet. That's why, you have different kinds of histories. You have environmental history. We have social history. And archaeology is a type of history. It's history of the earth. History of that I do is history of people, but it's connected to the earth too. So it's very akin to archaeology too. But we're connected, whether we like it or not. And so we might as well recognize that and realize that we're all part of it. We're individuals, but we're part of a collective as well, both in our families and in our societies, however large. And so, we live a nested existence that, we we talk about where we're from. You mentioned Williamson Road. That's that's a microcosm of where we're from. We're on two sides of Williamson Road, which you could almost throw a stone and hit it. But then it's like Google Maps. You kind of move out, and then you would say, "Oh, we're from Northwest Roanoke. We're from Roanoke. We're from Virginia. We're from the Eastern United States. We're from the United States. We're from the Earth." I mean, just keep moving out. And it's interesting if you travel around. If I'm in California and somebody says, "Where are you from?" I'd probably say Virginia, because I'm pretty sure they know what Virginia is, and leave it at that unless they say, "Well, where in Virginia?" "Oh, I'd say Southwest Virginia." One time I said that Southwest Virginia, and they said, "Oh, I've been to West Virginia." I said, "No, not Southwest Virginia, Southwest Virginia." And so, "Oh, where?" Roanoke. "Oh, it's off. Yeah, I've been there, near 81." And then, that usually stops there because they wouldn't know Williamson Road probably. If you were in France, for example, and somebody said, "Where are you from?" you'd probably say the United States and leave it at that, unless they said where and so forth. So we all have this nested existence, and it's interesting too that nostalgia, I think, draws us back to the place we start. And in fact, I know a guy I was talking to the other day. I found out that his father and I, his father and my father worked at Appalachian together, just complete happenstance. And my brother told me that his father was a pallbearer at my father's funeral, which is like, wow, small world, And I found that traveling around, when you talk to people, you always find some point of connection. There's always something that connects you, a mutual friend, something, you can find that connection. That seems to never fail. So, and people, this guy that I was talking to, our parents worked together, our fathers worked together at Appalachian, which is another long-standing Roanoke institution, although the headquarters are in Ohio. He had spent about 40 years working in the Library of Congress as a kind of librarian researcher thing, and he told me when he retired he moved back here. It's like the place you grow up is like a magnet. It draws you back, and I'm sure and almost everybody knows many people that have lived other places, but then you get drawn back to where you grow up because you have this attachment to it. One other word I might talk about, nostalgia, is another word that's really quite interesting that you almost never hear. It's a kind of a fancy word. The word is deracination, and the denotation of the word is uprootedness. But the connotation of the word is emotional, profound emotional alienation. And so when you're away from home among people that don't know who you are, you're like the opposite of the Cheers bar where everybody knows your name. We need that place. So your home is the place where everybody knows your name. You don't have to explain yourself. Like when I call you up, we've been friends for so long, I don't have to tell you different things. You can pick up on what my distress might be or what I might need. And it's mainly because we grew up in the same place. We know we're rooted. So we are the opposite of deracinated, right? We're emotionally connected. And it is, when you are deracinated, it's really unsettling. It's not just being uprooted from a place, it's being uprooted from the emotional place, the psychological uprootedness. And it's a really alienating thing.
Let me ask you a question about mentors and history, and see if I can understand better the connection between a mentor and history. And when I say mentor, let's just take an example of you want to be a carpenter. So you want to be a carpenter, so you apprentice under a skilled carpenter that knows everything about carpentry to be able to learn your trade. That person before you has learned his trade, and his trade as a whole has progressed over his lifetime to be from down here up to here. Now he's passing that on to another person, and that new person ain't going to start back here somewhere. They're going to start up here where the industry as a whole has progressed. Is that history? Because we're all kind of springboarding off of what everybody else has learned ahead of us. We're not starting at ground zero.
There's a quote by, I believe it's Francis Bacon, that we stand on the shoulders of giants as we move forward, and that's kind of what you're talking about. You don't have to go back to square one. You don't go, do not pass go, do not go forward. You stand on the people before, and so, but you're connected to them. You wouldn't be able to move forward without those people.
Well, is that not part of the draw? When I think of Roanoke, part of the draw of Roanoke and why I want to remember Roanoke is because those people that came before us were predominantly from Roanoke. Our mentors, I'm sure you had mentors as I did, are people we knew from Roanoke that taught us things we wouldn't have known otherwise, that inspired us, that gave us reason to go in certain paths. So I think that's one reason to not only desire to be in your hometown because of those memories, but it's also a great example of why we know what we know now, where we are right now is because of those previous experiences.
Yeah, it's part of giving back, and you feel that the place that rooted you, that taught you, which in who you became, that the giving back is more meaningful to that place other than other places because you don't have that root in other places, even though giving back other places would be fine, but you don't have that emotional connection to it.
Well, let's take some other examples of things that we'll be talking about in Roanoke Remembered in future episodes, but kind of shed some light from a historical perspective why it may be important. Let's just take places as an example. And when I was thinking of places, one of the things I was thinking about is places that were one thing when I was a kid. They became something else later on in life, and now they're actually a third thing. They've become a moving target in terms of what they did and how they contributed to Roanoke. And one I thought of was the Social Security building downtown on Jefferson Street, which is a prominent building now. You go there, old people go there now, like you and I, to get to modify our Social Security payments, that sort of thing. But when we were kids, that was the Elks Lodge. The Moose Lodge. No, I'm sorry, the Elks Lodge.
Some kind of lodge.
Some kind of big animal, but it had the elk out front. Yeah. Now the Elks moved over off of Brown to the new Elks Lodge, and then the Elks Lodge was torn down, and it became the Roanoke Motel. The Roanoke Motel ended up being a dormitory for Roanoke College, and now it's a Social Security building. Yeah, I know all these things because I'm old enough to experience it. Yeah. Someone now in Roanoke would just know it as a Social Security building. Is there any merit at all in that from a historical perspective?
Oh, absolutely. The thing I think about, there's a term called environmental racism, which every city's experienced. In fact, Roanoke, even to this day, is one of the most segregated cities in America. Environmental racism happened in most every city in the 70s in the interest of urban renewal, which was urban destruction, really. And what that refers to is, when interstates come through in the name of progress, where do they go through? They go through typically black neighborhoods that are able to muscle these people out who have no political agency to say, no, we want to protect our culture and our heritage, and they had no ability to do that. And so you see this all over America. And I think specifically in Roanoke, I think of, our parents' generation, the Tom Brokaw greatest generation, which I have a problem with that term, but it's another story. But they certainly were not the greatest generation related to race. And I remember what you're talking about, where the Civic Center is now, the Roanoke Civic Center, that was the segregated black area. And that's an example of environmental...
That'll sort of be a topic of a couple different episodes coming up, too.
Yeah. So that's an example of environmental racism. We would just kind of mow through there to create this.
That personally, what if Williamson Road had been that urban renewal and our homes weren't there anymore?
Yeah, again, that's you can be deracinated in the same physical place if you're the victim of environmental racism, because what you're connected to is gone. Now, the thing I remember, in our parents' generation, and they were just blind to the most part of their racism. And I remember as a kid, probably you could tell the same story. My wife Laura could tell us the same story. I remember driving when I was a kid, 7, 8, 9 years old, driving into downtown Roanoke, going through that area before the Civic Center was there, going through black communities. And I remember just kind of tightening up because that's where black people lived, and they didn't say black. They said the N-word. And you heard that all the time, just routinely when we're growing up from our parents. And That's just how people talked. And I remember just kind of tightening up, like somebody was going to jump in our car or something, driving through. We better get through here quick,
Yeah, it never was perceived as this is a community of people that are, loving people just like the people on Williamson Road. They have families.
Yeah, they're trying to raise their kids, trying to keep them safe, trying to teach them, going to school. That somehow.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that is going to be a feature of some future episodes. So, place is important, and whether your place is there when you grow up is important too. So whether things are torn down, which is going to be actually the next episode we're going to have is talk about the Evans house, which is one of the oldest houses in Roanoke that may be torn down. Is talking about that as a historical place, which is important.
Well, can I tell you one other quick story that was really illustrates what we're talking about? I taught at Radford with a guy named Reggie Sharif, who lived in Rugby area, still does as far as I'm aware, unless he's moved. He retired about 2 years ago or so. And he was in the political science department. And he was involved in some of the uncovering of some of the Roanoke racial issues in several books. And so in a book I used in the class, I had him come in as a guest because he was crucial to all this. And I don't think he knew, even though, we'd gotten together a couple times over the years, I don't think he knew I was from Roanoke. And so his payment for coming to my class, I took him out to dinner and we got to chat. And how, he grew up in the Rugby area. And his best friend was Milton Long, a guy I played at William Fleming, played on the basketball team with. And the line for Fleming and Addison went right through his neighborhood. So some of his friends went to Fleming, he had gone to Addison. Now Reggie's a great guy, and this is as the crow flies, I lived probably 2-3 miles from him as the crow flies, but racially it was 1,000,000 miles away. And it's just a shame, and I told this to the class at the time, that it's just a shame that the way segregation worked, that if it had been a different way, I would have known Reggie growing up, and we probably would have been good friends like you and I were.
Well, I'm glad you brought all this up because, when I say Roanoke Remember, when I say that, I want to remember the good and the not so good, the good, bad, and the ugly, because, as I said earlier, when you're nostalgic, you think everything was better than it was. It's just like you say, the best generation, the greatest generation. Maybe they were in some things, but they weren't in others, just like this generation is. So I don't want to be two rambling old guys that think everything was better back in the day than it is right now, because that's not true. So we want to talk about those things that weren't so good as well. Another example of that for me is Villa Heights Baptist Church, which we have under renovation now to become a church. The reason Villa Heights Baptist Church was empty for 40 years was because of white flight. It was a neighborhood that was all white. And then because of urban renewal, people started moving towards the Villa Heights area that were black, and it scared the white people away, and the church became empty because they built another church out in the suburbs so they could be comfortable. So those some of the kinds of things that I think historically we need to remember going forward.
Yeah, there's a historical fallacy of this called the rose-colored glasses fallacy. That is, when we look at the past, we tend to put on rose-colored glasses and not see the negative things. And it's part of this, in the good old days, things were better. No, they weren't. In fact, in many ways, they were worse. One of the ways I always started my survey level classes with students was to say, look, the United States, it's a tale of two countries. We're a great country and we're a terrible country. Both of those are true. And so to get the true history of the past, you've got to look at both the negative and the positive. That the ideals that we espouse are fantastic. All men are created equal and all that. These are great ideals. Who can argue with those? But the reality is quite different. And so I would say in general, our struggle nationally and locally throughout the United States has been to try to close the gap between the ideals and the reality. And it's not a straight line. And I would say in the last 10 decades or so, we've taken 2 or 3 steps backward on closing that gap between the reality and the
well, that's what I like to learn going forward with Roanoke Remembered is the things that have been corrected that weren't right, things that we're still working on, and things that we can learn from. And I know people's going to be a big part of that. One of the things I want to look at in Roanoke Remembered is personalities in the past, whether it be, I've mentioned the mayor a couple times. I think, one of the best mayors we've ever had in the past is Noel Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
First black mayor for Roanoke, did a lot of good for Roanoke. And so if you explore a life like that and understand what contributions he made to Roanoke, then we can benefit from that and try to mimic some of those things going forward. Or think about the city manager that we've had in the past. I think of Bern Ewart, who did Design 79, which kind of brought the market back to life downtown. That some people just don't remember because they're too young to remember it. So old guys like us can bring that stuff out and talk about it and use that for, where do we need another Design 79?
Well, your church example, I have a personal example with that. I grew up in the First Church of the Brethren, which is beside Monroe Junior High School. But before I was born, that church was in a changing community. And in the early 50s, they moved the church to where it is now in the early 50s to get away from the black community that was flooding in around that original site. And then the same thing happened at the new site. And there's an old saw, I'm not sure who originally said this, Martin Luther King Jr. maybe, that 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. And there's a black church literally next door to First Church of the Brethren. And I don't think First Church even now has any black members, and vice versa for white members of that church. But what they have done as a bow, I suppose, to some kind of reconciliation is to have, and they even did this when I was a kid, one Sunday out of the year they would have the black pastor take the pulpit in our white church and vice versa.
Well, one thing I'm excited about, and we're going to have to wrap it up. We could talk all day.
Absolutely.
I'm excited about some of the things I know we're going to talk about in the future, but I attend a church called the Hill Church, which is going to be occupying the old Villa Heights Baptist Church, and it's, I think, the first fully integrated church in Roanoke where half the members are white, half the members are black, which is very unusual, but it's very, very refreshing and very 21st century, because we certainly didn't experience that growing up. So in the future, our next podcast, which will hopefully be 1 week from now, we're going to talk about the Evans House and possibly Evans Spring, or maybe break that up into 2 different episodes. But the Evans House, for those who don't know anything about that house, it's reportedly the oldest still standing house. I say standing with quotes around it because it's not standing very well. Will be our next topic of discussion. I'll have a guest come in, a historical preservationist, that will help me with that episode. And I also hope to talk about mentors, about people that were our mentors in the past and how that affected us. And I've got 20 or 25 different topics lined up right now, and hopefully have someone of your caliber coming in here to talk to us each time to lead us in that discussion. Whatever the topic of the day is, it'll be a professional or someone very skilled in that particular area. So next week I'm hoping to have a historic preservationist to help me talk through Evans House. So any parting comment before we adjourn this episode number 1?
I have a couple things, I suppose, but I know we're out of time. You were talking about mentors in history. There's an analogy historically the guild system had the apprentices, journeymen, and masters, and it operated different in America because you owned your own shop, you're the master. But we have the same thing in history in a sense with history majors, that typically there's a class like History 295 at Radford where we teach history majors how to do research, the primary sources, and how they have to write papers based on what historians actually do. When I taught survey level classes to non-history majors mostly, it's sort of like the craftsman who would give somebody an instruction on how to assemble something. With historians teaching history majors, it's like we're teaching them how to make that thing, not just how to assemble it.
Well, this concludes episode number 1, and I appreciate it, John Boyd, for all your historical perspectives.
And you need to double my pay.
Okay, I'll do that. Thank you. Join us next week.